Yeah, so in the context of tech investing, unicorns are referred to the private startups, the unlisted startups that have a valuation of more than 1 billion US dollars. Yeah, and now we are talking about a group of sovereign funds that are becoming the new venture capitalists. And since they are dealing with billions, a billions valuation of tech unicorns, of course, these are trillion-dollar guys. And that's really the context of this discussion. Now, to put this into context, a quick question, right? Who do you think holds the power in the capital markets? For many people, they would think it's the glamorous investment banks, right? Like Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs. Or some people will think about the large asset owners, asset managers like Blackstone, BlackRock. Or some people will think of those high profile hedge funds like Bridgewater. But what we today we'll talk about is the money behind these people. There's we refer to them as the sovereign funds, and they collectively own more than $30 trillion. And they are the money behind the Wall Street players. And here we are. So it's helpful to think about the sovereign funds in three groups. One is what we refer to as the sovereign wealth funds. These are the government funds that manage national treasuries. For example, typical example is the Middle East funds, right? They have a lot of oil money, and they set up a fund to manage that money for the future generations. So that's the sovereign wealth funds. Or another group is the government pension funds. They collectively manage pension money and is subject to government regulations. In the US, we have very famous pensions in California, known as CalPERS, CalSTRS, so on and so forth. And the third group is the central banks, right? For every country, there's a central bank that manages their foreign reserve. And for some central banks, they have an investment arm that makes global investments. And that's also very influential in the capital markets. So with these three groups, let's take off some of the top players. Here's a list of the sovereign wealth fund top 10. And it's interesting that China has all three, and they represent these three groups, right? The China Invest Corp is a sovereign wealth fund. It manages portions of China's foreign reserve coming from import-export surplus. It's about $1 trillion, and that's where I used to work at. Another one is National Council for Social Security Fund. It's a government pension fund for Chinese people. And then the third is SAFE, State Administration of Foreign Exchange, which is the investment arm of the Central Bank of China. And here it lists about $500 billion, but that's too small for them. In fact, they are the largest U.S. government bonds holder in the world, close to $2 trillion. So if you add that, they can easily become the largest sovereign fund of the world. But of course, because of China, all the different pockets belong to the government, so they are all viewed as as sovereign wealth funds. But it's interesting here in this list, we see most of the people, most of them are from emerging markets, right? Here you see the Singapore, Temasek, GIC, and you have the Middle East countries like Qatar, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, of UAE, and this is keep this in mind, because the sovereign funds represent this changing balance between emerging markets and OECD countries. And here is the list of the pension funds. What's really interesting is the US actually has the biggest one, the Social Security Trust funds. But typically people hear about the pension funds from other countries. For example, the Canadian pensions are very active in the market, as well as some of the European funds and even the Japan funds, South Korea funds. Now, up till now, you may come up with this question, like, how come some of the funds we hear in the news, some of the funds, even including the largest social security fund in the world, the US fund, we never hear about them in the capital markets. We don't read about them in the Wall Street Journal, right? And the answer to that is the different investment styles among these sovereign funds. Some are very passive, like the U.S. Security Trust Fund. Some are very active, for example, the Canadian pensions. And their hunt for unicorns is a reflection of the increasingly active style of these players. So here is the quick background of what we're talking about, right? Traditionally, the sovereign investors at the top of the chart are typically the limited partners of a fund, which means they give money to external managers to manage the capital for them. And then venture fund, run by the GP, the external manager, put money into external companies, which are the portfolio investments in this chart. And in more recent years, some of the funds, sovereign funds, say, hey, we can do this maybe if we pick up the market experience, right? So what they started was to co-investing with the external managers. So here we see for portfolio investment 3, they also put additional money besides their LP commitment to the fund. They put additional money into portfolio investment 3 as a direct shareholder of the company. And through this process, they work on the investment with the venture fund, and they also get involved in the post-investment corporate management. Through this, they learn about direct investing, and eventually, in more recent years, they become direct investors themselves because they feel like they can just do the same thing without paying the management fee to the external managers. So this is so far, a background of the evolution of the sovereign funds last several decades. Starting from passive money into co-investing money with external managers, and now the latest is they become the direct investor, right? And the best example for that, actually maybe the mainstream start for that trend, was the last financial crisis, a little more than 10 years ago, 2008. When Wall Street banks were in trouble, these sovereign funds actually become the white knight saviors. In particular, Citibank, best example, it got money from all over the world, different sovereign funds, including the Singapore sovereign funds, GIC and Temasek, the UAE, ADIA from the Middle East, as well as the KIA. Together, they put $10 billion into that. And if you think about that, that's more than a typical PE fund, right? Even for the large PE fund. So, which means they really have the large capital pool to do large transactions. And that was also the same time I joined the CIC. CIC was set up at the 2007, and maybe it's good luck or bad luck. It started with the financial crisis, and the first few investments were in the Wall Street big firms. First there was $3 billion investment in Blackstone's IPO, summer of 2017, same year, end of 2017. If you're young enough to remember that was the start of the last financial crisis. Morgan Stanley got into trouble, and the CIC put in close to $7 billion into that troubled bank to help Morgan Stanley to stay afloat. Otherwise, the House of Morgan may actually disappear, which is scary. So I call this the good old days. To me, if you can see the number on my door card, I was the first 100 people started at CIC, and also I got my CIC watch for being there for the first 5 years. But I also refer those as the good old days for another 2 reasons. One, that was the start, right, of this mainstream direct investing by these sovereign funds, and every day we're, since the last financial crisis, every day we are seeing their activities more and more, which includes the current crisis, and also, that was the time where, in the middle of the crisis, right, all the capital was welcomed, especially in the U.S. Yeah, but today, where we're seeing more and more cross-border regulations that restrict this capital flow from foreign sovereign funds, and this will be covered, later in this presentation. So there's a huge change during the last 10 years for this landscape, and of course, to focus our discussion, right, the main thing they're focusing right now is to invest into the tech industry. Globally, there's a consensus that technology is the future, and the global economy is going to become a digital economy. So every country is focusing on that theme. Not surprisingly, this group of sovereign funds, $30 trillion of asset owners are putting their focus in the tech investing. Some take the form of fund. So here the best example is Vision Fund, $100 billion. Just to put this into context, right? A typical VC fund is about $100 million or even less. So here we're talking about a VC fund that is 1,000 times bigger than a typical VC fund in Silicon Valley. So of course they're changing the rule of the VC plays. Where the money come from? Mainly two sovereign funds in the Middle East. The PIF of Saudi Arabia and the Mubadala of UAE. Collectively they put $60 billion together, and SoftBank put Masayoshi-san, put some more. Altogether, they get to this 100 billion thing. And their latest success was the investment into Airbnb, which was IPO'd a few months ago. But they also had some dramatic loss, right, from investment into things like WeWork.
Do they invest in early stage or mostly late stage?
Great question, Shubh. Because they have $100 billion, actually early stage investments become too difficult for them. Consider this as a problem that a rich guy have, that they can only invest in large enough companies. So, just to relate to WeWork, right? It's an example that people think big and then talk about a big story, but it never delivered. But nevertheless, the fund put in large ticket investment into it. So they're changing the rule of the VC game, but they also suffer some of the drawbacks. Yeah? And for some, they just go directly into startups without just setting up a fund, right? So here we talk about Enter Financial, which is the financial arm of Alibaba, the China's internet platform giant. It planned to go IPO a couple months ago, and because of the China regulations, it has to be suspended. But still, based on its financing 2 years ago, it is still the largest unicorn in the world, with a valuation of $150 billion. That's more than the market cap of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, believe it or not. But that just shows the commitment from these sovereign funds. And here, it's a company that takes money from all over the world, from Singapore to Malaysia, from Vision Fund to Canada. Yeah, and now the latest of the story is that some of the countries are setting up dedicated funds to finance research and technology, and we can call these sovereign development funds. What's the difference here is they have very obvious government agenda. So here's an example, right? Chinese semiconductor fund. Last year, China put a dedicated fund to invest into semiconductor chips for $30 billion. And the background of that, not surprisingly, if you recall what happened to the US sanctions on Chinese network companies like Huawei, ZTE, the purpose of this is to finance Chinese domestic semiconductor technology research in the hope that China will become self-reliant on semiconductor chips, from the US supply chains. And here, just to finish my part of presentation, I will go with one specific case study, a case study of a Chinese semiconductor company that got caught up in the sovereign capital of the China and the US. So here it is. It's called SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing Investment Corporation. Now, it was listed in the US and Hong Kong before, but last year it delisted. partly because they expect the new U.S. law to audit Chinese companies, past the December 2020, and also part of the reason I think was to receive investment from China's semiconductor sovereign fund. And yes, they did. After they delisted from the U.S. May 2020, that they got billions of investments from China sovereign funds for semiconductor. Actually, two of them. One is the national level, another is at the Shanghai city level. But cumulatively, they got more than $2 billion from the sovereign funds from China. And in the same year, just 2 months after that, they got relisted in the China's new board, this kind of the China's NASDAQ, got a huge valuation. So far, so good, right? But then, of course, the U.S. is taking notice. You know why? Because the funding of this $2 billion plus was revealed on the same day that the U.S. announced new restrictions on Huawei. And the message was almost like the Chinese company SMIC may become the new supplier to Huawei, since Huawei is subject to US sanctions, which makes it hard to find global supplies. So the US took action. September 2020, just several months after the Chinese sovereign fund investment and the Shanghai listing, US Commerce Department put SMC on sanctions to limit its capacity to source American technology. But that's not the ending. Actually, December 2020, US took more actions. Now the Defense Department added the company to another blacklist. And this list is about money flow, which bans US investors from buying this share. Yeah, and during the same month, the company co-CEO resigned, maybe because he thought, with all the sanctions, limiting capital flow, limiting technology flow, he could not deliver the domestic manufacturing of chips. Yeah, of course, the stock tanked again. But still, it didn't end there. Commerce Department in December added it to the official trade sanction list, the entity list. So makes the trade restriction official. And because of the military blacklist, in January, all the major indexes like MSIC, S&P index, and other indexes, removed the stock from the index because of the stock ban from the U.S. government, right? Of course, triggering more selling of the stock. So the punchline is, within 6 months, the company stock has lost more than half of its value from its July peak. Yeah. So what I conclude from this is that when we talk about these sovereign capital flow and the related sovereign regulations, it's not just about Trump president wants to make headlines. Actually, the impact is real. And in this case, this poor company, it lost more than 50% of its value within just 6 months. So with this, I transition to Paul.
I had one question before Paul, you come in.
Yes.
So you describe these sovereign funds as national capital, there's pension money, and so on.
Yep.
You wouldn't ordinarily think of the investment objectives of such funds to be somewhat conservative. Instead,
Yep.
here we are talking about investment into high beta assets with lots of regulatory and cross-border risk. How does that compute? I mean, we are managing national resources and investing in high-risk assets. How does that work?
Yes. Yep. So this really relates to the fund's structure. For a sovereign fund that has obvious liability, let's say a pension fund that has a lot of payout to its constituents, then their investment style naturally becomes more risk averse, right? As in the case of the U.S. Savings Trust, because their purpose is to deliver the future pension liability, and their mandate is not to develop technology or create a new Silicon Valley, right? So those guys are very conservative. But by contrast, right, for many emerging markets, sovereign funds, since their wealth let's say, is not forever. Let's say Qatar, right? Small country with limited, with gas resources, huge amount of money, but it's not forever. So what they really need to do is to invest this money smartly, and one part obviously is for good returns for the money, but another part is to answer the question: how can I invest in this money so that I can transform my economy, right, to be diversified away from my oil gas origin? Instead, I can instead, how can I use the money to invest into the future technology so that my economies can be transformed to remain competitive going forward when the oil gas are depleted? I think their structure and their obligations and their missions really defines their investment style. Sure.
Thank you, Winston.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
I know this is great. Yeah. So to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Winston, and thank you, Shubh. And it's a pleasure to be talking to this distinguished group at International House this evening. So we've heard from Winston the very interesting story, which we analyzed to a medieval legend of the hunt for the unicorn, of the rise of these immense pools of cash under government control. But it's a fairy tale, it's a legend, so there has to be some conflict in it, some drama. So I'm going to be talking about the pushback and the drama that you see on the investee side. The first slide you'll see running up the left-hand side is something called CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is a national security review panel in the United States. Despite the great conflict between Democrats and Republicans in Congress during the Trump administration, they got together in 2018 and considerably expanded National Security Review to focus on investment in the digital economy. Now, if you're looking outside the United States and you see $30 trillion of government-directed funding towards your digital economy, maybe you think that this is merited and you go forward with it. So what happened was, what was originally designed as a system to protect against investment in something like weaponry or missile technology suddenly expanded to vague areas: critical infrastructure, critical technology, sensitive personal data. And we'll see from the next slide that this, we can go to the next slide, great, thanks. We'll see that this is just the latest step in a sort of drumbeat of pushback from the United States that's not really limited to the current outgoing administration, but goes back to the first President Bush, to President Obama, and several times to President Trump. This is a list of deals that actually got through the whole CFIUS national security review process and were blocked. It doesn't include many, many others that never got that far. They just got discouraged, they gave up. The pattern you see here is it starts out with something that looks very much like military or weapons technology. The second one actually involved a wind farm, but it was right next to a military base. But as you get down later and later, you get down to the bottom, it's a hospitality sector company, which is hard to align with the national security risk, but that's how it's seen. We go to the next slide. You'll see that the idea just evolved and evolved. Starting from the bottom here, these are three deals that the first at the bottom was essentially the clock ran out. Ant Financial, which you saw in an earlier slide, sought to acquire MoneyGram, which is a business that basically sends money for people who don't have bank accounts to their families abroad for the most part. So their big sector is remittances from Latin American laborers in the United States to their families in Mexico and Central America and elsewhere in Latin America. When Ant Financial looked at it, it was so shocking to think there was a national security issue here, but it got put off, and finally they walked away from the deal. Grindr is a gay dating app. There, it got permitted to go ahead, but the government came back, U.S. government came back and has forced a divestment. The issue there apparently is the sensitive personal data of the people who sign up for it, and it's very sophisticated geolocation services which show where the people are. And then finally, you tell me what is a national security risk over TikTok, the short form musical app. But again, this one got an order of divestment, which is being fought out in the courts right now, and are not only CFIUS, but other pieces of legislation. We go to the next slide. The US has also been battling it out in 5G and has called upon other supposedly similarly positioned or like-minded countries to sign on board with various levels of success. So using its own national security apparatus, has retooled it, the US, towards the digital economy investment by this huge wall of foreign capital. It's also sought to extend its national security analysis to other countries, Australia, the UK, and India, to get them to back off from using Chinese technology in their 5G systems as they build out. Next slide. So not only has the US sought to go through its national security review system and expand it, has sought to expand the notion of its national security review to other countries. It's also taken a page out of the playbook of the sovereign funds themselves and set up its own national funds that seek to foster development in the digital sector. One is the 5G tech R&D fund, which is to be funded out of sales of spectrum. The other one on the far right is a European 5G holding company. The US does not have a 5G champion like Huawei, so talk has been bandied about acquiring either Ericsson or Nokia in Europe, which do have 5G capabilities. This may be a pipe dream now that the Biden administration is stepping in. But the Development Finance Corporation, as you'll see from the next slide, is actually a well-funded $60 billion fund that the US has set up to do direct investments, a lot of them in the digital space, in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. It's put $2 billion into Indonesia's sovereign wealth fund, which is an interesting development in sort of cross-border collaboration using the sovereign investor model. And as in the case with the Huawei ban, the fund is partnering with Japan, Australia, maybe India, in something called the Blue Dot Network. We go to the next slide. We'll see a little bit about the Blue Dot Network. Blue Dot Network, I had to look this one up. Blue Dot apparently refers to the way the planet Earth appears from far in space. It's a small blue dot because of the oceans. But it is intended really as a counterweight to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So the notion here is that the US will ally with other countries, expand its funds to invest in various projects around the world, again, using the sovereign investor, sovereign fund model as a tool for expanding its political and economic influence in parts of the world to counter what it sees happening for other sovereign funds. That's right, go to the next slide. So what's happening in other countries? Indonesia, seeing the possibilities here, has set up its own sovereign fund. So Indonesia doesn't have oil wealth. It doesn't have export surpluses like other countries that have set up sovereign wealth funds. So it's gone and decided it can pass the hat around and raise the sovereign wealth fund by investments from the UAE, from the Middle East. Japan's put $4 billion, and the U.S. In its whole Blue Dot initiative has come in with $2 billion. So the sovereign wealth fund, sovereign investment fund, is sort of morphed into a whole different type of entity to again spur digital development of an economy. Interesting development we're seeing here. With all the money comes some strings attached. A couple of the large funds, Vision Fund we mentioned earlier, and Temasek, one of the large Singaporean-based funds, have both invested heavily in Indonesia in digital unicorns. And they put some pressure on them. And the idea is to have them combine. Maybe not necessarily something that would happen without the involvement of the sovereign investors in the digital economy in Indonesia, but an interesting development nonetheless. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see that India has also recently gotten in the act. India, interestingly enough, is clearly neither the US nor China, which are the main growth areas for digital unicorns, but has seen a window open and brought in, interesting, a lot of Middle Eastern sovereign funds, ADIA from the UAE and Mubadala, its twin from the UAE, and PIF, we mentioned earlier, from Saudi Arabia, have followed Facebook into an investment in Geo Platforms, the huge e-commerce entity. All this money and more actually was raised in the course of about 6 weeks during the height of the pandemic earlier this year. So it's very interesting to see this movement is going on. Sovereign funds in the last slide also are doing other interesting things, teaming up cross-border. PIF has looked in the other direction to Egypt, has set up a $16 billion fund. Egypt, although it's discovered natural resources, doesn't really have the sources for a fund. So PIF has stepped in. RDIF, which is a Russian fund, and Mubadala have teamed together on artificial intelligence, logistics, and health. And Temasek, we mentioned earlier, and Khazanah, the National Sovereign Wealth Fund of Malaysia, the good one, not the one that you read about, the yachts and everything else, have collaborated on a smart cities initiative to develop a smart city in Indonesia, right across the border from the city-state of Singapore. So in conclusion, we've sort of gone from the pushback, the drama, the conflict in the hunt for unicorns to perhaps a model for future collaboration across the world to foster digital development. You can read all about it in the book. Thanks so much to all of you.
Thank you, Winston. Thank you, Paul, for a great presentation. So maybe I'll kick off with a couple of questions, and then please, the audience, invite you to present questions. I know Nidhi has already asked one in the chat, so please join in. So in this description that you went through, we talked about multiple objectives. We talked about investment objectives. We talked about influence, geopolitical influence. We talked about fostering local champions. So Europeans are trying to do 5G, etc. I mean, it seems like a mishmash of objectives. And how does that impact price discovery? I mean, you know, if somebody is trying to invest for the purposes of influence, they may not be as concerned about price, whereas somebody who cares about investment does. Are these sovereign funds disciplined in their investment, or are they sort of, they've got lots of money and therefore they're being aggressive in the marketplace?
Why don't you take a first stab at that, Winston?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shubh. You know, because when I was in China, certainly we had this discussion every day, right? But you know, these days, actually, since so many funds are pursuing these multiple objectives, so actually there's a new term for this, not only in China or even emerging markets, you know, but also in the European countries, and they refer to this as this concept of double bottom lines, and this concept comes from Ireland. The sovereign fund of the island came up with this term because in 2008, during the financial crisis, their main focus was to save the banks. And after the crisis, you know, since the economy was stabilized, and their mandate by national law of Ireland was changed to promote domestic economic development. As a result, they come up with this term, double bottom lines, saying that when they look for deals, they pursue both investment returns and economic promotion. Yeah, and so far they have done it great. And now speaking my own experience, right? It's always difficult, but it seems like there's a possible way to balance these multiple objectives.
Yeah, and just to add to that and to complicate the picture even more, there's also a growing trend to focus on socially aware and sustainable investments, which adds another wrinkle to what these sovereign investors do. Particularly if you're talking about someplace like Norway or New Zealand, this is a higher priority than it might be in another emerging country. So it's not a straightforward picture. They're not all the same.
Yeah, no, in fact, I was about to go there, that, you talked earlier that they've sort of morphed from being passive investors into more active investors. And so the question is, how have they morphed also to become activists, such as in ESG, et cetera, but also maybe for geopolitical kind of thing. I had another question around, what do they bring to the table beyond money? So when somebody went to Sand Hill Road or go to Blackstone or Carlyle, they bring beyond money, relationship, expertise, mentorship. There's a whole series of value propositions that they bring. Do sovereign funds have the same capabilities and value proposition for these companies?
Great question. And the answer is definitely yes. I have seen that in the CSC context. And the benefit of the CSC money is the largest digital market in the background, right? The China market, with more than 900 million users, unified by the same culture, same language, and same mobile payment. It's a huge internet network, right? So when I set up an investment vehicle in Silicon Valley 10 years ago, it's called West Summit Capital. The idea was to invest into US Silicon Valley apps and then connect them with the large market in China as a value creation, right? This really worked because for our presence in Silicon Valley, we're not the PayPal gang, we're not the Google gang. How do we get the deal? We talk to people that if we're part of the transaction, if we're in their round A or round B, actually we bring them to connect with China, right? China market. So that's one part, and another part is on the policy side, and you see this really in connection with CIC, but you see more of these plays relating to the Middle East guys. As I mentioned, right? They have oil, but they have to transform their economies. So what we have seen is, in particular, Saudi Arabia and Mubadala of UAE, what they're really working on is to develop a Middle East innovation center. So when they invest in overseas companies, they will say, hey, take our money and then I will bring you to our market, right? And they do not have the same size of market like China, but they say, we are local and we give you all the right policies to develop. So that makes their money different. Paul?
Right, and also, as you saw in the slide in Indonesia, if you have these large investors and they have large positions in various companies in related but not identical fields, they can facilitate combinations which transform the companies in ways that probably wouldn't happen if you just had individual smaller funds, each one invested in one and willing to fight to the end. So the sheer scale of some of these funds is more than money in itself, because it brings with it portfolio of other investments and windows into other markets. The Singaporeans have been particularly good at this.
Now, we obviously talking about digital unicorns, and there's this quote that's gone viral, which is data is the new oil, right? This is where the action is. But oil is also the place where there's been a lot of geopolitical jostling and wars and so on. While in this space of sovereign funds and digital, we've seen some of the regulatory activities through CFIUS and so on. Are we likely to see geopolitical contention move into this realm? Because governments are involved and they are investing in entities that are really central to the way we live. Are we going to end up in a sort of a fragmented universe, given the kinds of challenges that this might lead to?
Yeah. I think we're well on the way there. Shubh. Winston, you've written a lot about this.
Yeah. So your page already covered that. So Paul, I just I'll touch on some different points, before you go back to your slides,
Right.
On those cases, and since from the China perspective, right? From the China perspective, you can see very interestingly what's happening in China market today is that the government wants to make the data a public asset. And in this way, I think it's almost like make the data national treasury. So, in the example Alibaba, right? We talk about the suspension of IP of Ant Financial, and part of the reason for that is the increasing data regulation from the central government. And now the latest message from the central government to Alibaba and Ant Financial is that yes, you have this 900 million internet users data on your platform, which makes your lending, right, your small amount lending more efficient than the traditional banks. However, from a government perspective, that's viewed as an unfair competition. And what the government wants to do is to make this data also available to other state-owned banks, so that people can use the same kind of user behavior data to compete, to make the whole industry more efficient instead of just one company, right? So if you think about this, if the data cannot be kept by Alibaba, do you think the data can be kept by a foreign buyer? Maybe not. So back to you, Paul.
Yeah, I think the whole dispute over TikTok is almost emblematic of this, and with the recent events in the U.S. Capitol, where you have basically social media platforms shutting down the voice of the President of the United States. Clearly, the whole digital economy, the digital world has moved into the political realm, and I think at this point there's no going back. And interestingly enough, you've got parallels in the U.S. where the digital giants are coming under greater scrutiny, and in China at the same time, the digital giants are coming under attack. So this is not unique to any system. It's a development as we become more and more dependent on these giants.
Paul, you mentioned earlier about Norwegian funds sort of looking at ESG and so on. We have a question from Nazar. Beyond the Europeans who would be the usual suspects in terms of these kinds of activities, are we seeing more focus on ESG by, for example, Middle Eastern funds or Chinese funds? What is their attitude towards these initiatives or the sustainable development goals? Are they pushing there?
I'm seeing a lot of it. New Zealand is probably a prime example, but maybe that falls more into almost the European category. Singapore has been very focused on sustainability. A lot of the funds look at it from the perspective of prudent investing, that if you're putting tens of billions of dollars into a sector, you ought to make sure that it's going to be around at the end of the day, which means looking at sustainability as issue. Social responsibility is another one. New Zealand very quickly organized a wide-ranging consortium of similar funds, pension funds, as well as sovereign wealth funds, after the Christchurch attacks, in an effort to pressure the digital giants to limit live streaming of violence and so forth. So you do see that. You hear some of this out of the Middle Eastern funds. PIF, the large Saudi fund, is funding Neom City, which is meant to be a sustainable, largely renewably energy powered new city on the Red Sea coast. So maybe surprising, but you're seeing it in a lot of places.
Yeah, I would quickly add, there's one alliance among the sovereign funds, mostly the oil funds, called One Planet, and it's the five Middle East funds plus Norwegian, plus the only non-oil component, the New Zealand fund that Paul just mentioned, right? And this One Planet alliance was created to create this best practice about dealing with fossil fuel divestment, about the transformation of the energy landscape. Considering these guys are the largest oil producers, they certainly understand the energy market, right? And then what they try to do is to be this kind of resource for global institutions in terms of dealing with this and climate change in particular issues. And I think they given their large size, collectively they represent multiple trillions. That can be a very powerful force to promote that concept.
We have a question from Lorraine, which sort of gets to the notion that in various countries, the companies that where a sovereign fund would be looking to invest in, their relationship with governments varies. Some places they are very dependent on the national security infrastructure, for example. Other places the links are weaker. How does that impact investment flows? So by construction, it's all yet another dimension that's coming into the mix. So some companies might be able to attract some of this capital. Other companies would be cut off from this capital. Just talk a little bit about that complexity as these funds look for investments around.
Well, let me start off, if I may, Winston, from sort of the national security viewpoint, which we talked about, as I talked about in some of the slides earlier. There's a very real issue. We had a long list of deals that were essentially nixed, but there's a very extensive list of deals, probably more than we'll ever know, that never got born or were never pursued or were dropped early on because of precisely these types of concerns. And what is interesting is that what has happened is that the definition of what is a national security concern has morphed and expanded and mushroomed so that almost any deal that is looked at by a foreign government-backed entity, at least in the United States and increasingly elsewhere, is subject to questions about whether we should undergo a national security review. Because if you have a gay dating app or a short-form musical video app that is deemed a national security risk, what's left?
Great, Paul. You commented from the national security perspective. I can answer this question from the SOE perspective. What is a state-owned enterprises, right? All I can say is it's getting more and more complex and murky. And the best example is last week, right? China, EU announced entering this bilateral investment treaty. Viewed as, this is viewed as a huge thing, right? It's not yet fully approved, but it's expected to be approved, and it's expected to be challenged, expect to be persuaded by the new Biden administration to drop it, right? But the one important concept of this bilateral investment treaty between EU and China, it is about state-owned companies. And I think maybe EU is worrying about China's SOEs may have unfair advantage, right? So the treaty has this term about competitive neutrality, which means when you have a state-owned companies, they should not have unfair advantage. But my reaction to that is it's so hard to define that, right? And it's very hard to enforce that, especially that all the countries themselves are trying to use sovereign power for government agenda, including EU itself. Yeah, EU is contemplating a sovereign fund for technology development by itself. Actually, in 2019, they were talking about $100 billion number is to quote unquote cultivate our own tech champions like Facebook and Alibaba, right? So I think we're like in this crossroad right now. Like every country is saying investing tech is important, but every country is also saying data is our national security, right? And every country is saying, hey, your SOE, your sovereign capital backed companies should not have unfair advantage. But at the same time, every country, EU as well, saying we should cultivate our own tech champions. This is kind of this murky world we are living in. Sure.
Lots of legal issues, which should keep Paul and Winston busy for a long time. In the interest of time, the last two questions. There's a question from Babak, curious about the Indonesian sovereign fund, which was it's as you described, is somewhat different from the others in the sense it's trying to attract funds from overseas investors. So how is it structured? What does it offer to these investors? just to talk a little bit more about that.
I think it's part of the trend of countries setting up sovereign wealth funds, not because they have trade surpluses or huge oil reserves, but rather as a way to attract foreign sovereign investors into their domestic system. And it is a convenient way for the foreign money to come in allied with the local government in a way that is not a direct loan or anything. So the Indonesian fund falls into that category. The UAE money that came in originally was targeted towards building a new capital. Talk about sustainability. Jakarta is sinking under the sea, so they want to build a new sustainable capital. And I think the U.S. and Japan sort of jumped on the bandwagon, seeing a means to perhaps have some influence in Indonesia. I don't know, Winston, if you have a different take on that.
It's great, yeah. Sure. Just so you know, right? Babak is a mutual friend of mine, and Paul, former colleague of Paul, a prominent tax lawyer. So there's certainly a tax angle to that question. To me, there's an obvious difference in this Indonesia fund, in that it is not a, first it attracts other countries' money, but we have seen that before, like for example, in India, right? It has the National Infrastructure Fund with money from multiple sovereign investors. And here, Indonesia, I think what makes it even more unique is I think it put a lot of focus on attracting more capital from private equity funds of the US. Apparently, they're talking to Blackstone type of guys. And to me, this is a very different kind of game, because when you have capital pool from sovereign and non-sovereign money, including a PE fund, which also has very complex different capital sources. In the end, the sovereign exemption for tax may be difficult for this fund. Paul, do you want to comment further on that?
I think the jury is out on Indonesia. I think it's interesting. I see it really as an opportunity for a country which doesn't have much in the way of resources to see that it's an attractive target. Clearly, with the Gojek Tokopedia transactions, they do have a thriving, developing digital sector. And I think they see that with this battle going on between the US and China, maybe there's an opening for them to come in and collect some money from lots of different sources, sovereigns and PE funds as well.
So the last question, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, since you look at all these funds, what is the next frontier of their investment? Where are they putting their money? Because we can learn from that maybe for ourselves.
To me, the new frontier is actually ESG investing, big time. But it will be in a different context. In the past, they put money into, let's say, kind of from as a separate allocation. They say, yeah, out of our portfolio, we should have some exposure to ESG investing. But now, apparently, it becomes mainstream, and the new direction is to incorporate ESG components in consideration of the total portfolio, for every investments, right? But of course, this cannot be done easily, to the extent that there's a limited good data about what ESG investing really is, right? But hopefully their hunt for unicorns will fill this gap, right? By investing into new technologies, they not only get high returns from the investment. In addition, they also get more tech tools, right, to improve their decision-making process, and as well as their capability to evaluate the actual ESG or SDG impact. Paul?
Yeah, I think that's clearly a major trend and a movement forward. I think another sort of trend that we're seeing is their desire to integrate their own digital capabilities into their investment programs, so that you have a combination of resourcing the digital growth back into the home country, into hubs and so forth. And at the same time, taking the digital expertise that they've developed internally, monitoring all these assets and having their fingers in all the different pies, and using that to create new opportunities, new countries, and turn themselves into, as we say in the book, so the fintech superpowers, because they see it all. And as we see in the example in Indonesia, you have some foreign funds that have come in and say, oh, well, actually you have e-commerce and you have ride sharing, and maybe put them together, you can get banking and fintech and so forth in there. This is something that wouldn't happen without that. So I think this is kind of on the cusp of the future, and it relates to sustainability as well.
I know we are over time. So thank you so much, Winston and Paul, for a fantastic discussion on a really exciting topic. Your book sort of touches on 3 hot button topics: global capital, digital revolution, and geopolitics. And you've covered a lot of waterfront today. So thank you once again. I really appreciate your time. And the book, for those of you interested, is available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or your near neighborhood.
It's on display on the Fifth Avenue flagship store.
Right. Thank you very much, Shubh, for stepping in. And I want to say special thanks to Winston, who's been a good friend of International House. He's actually been to a Sunday supper and was at the Shanghai Gala as an attendee. So I want to thank him for keeping up that relationship. Thanks, and thanks to everyone.